right now, those same reasons.
Well, while you're reconciling, let me ask you another question about how you reconcile something else. You oppose financial aid to Israel, as you do to all countries, in fairness to you, although you favor the continuation of what you call strategic aid to Israel. Is that splitting hairs? How do you reconcile those two statements?
Well, strategic aid, they are they are an ally. And having been to Israel, having visited with Benjamin Netanyahu, Shimon Peres, Ariel Sharon, the big takeaway that I had having visited Israel is that they really don't need our assistance at all. They are best able to determine their own outcomes. And it's really a fallacy, or it's wrong on behalf of the United States to think that we can presume how to answer or to solve the problems that they do have.
Dr. Stein, you have proposed that the U.S. stop arming, using your words here, stop arming and funding governments committing war crimes, among them Israel. Do you believe then that the U.S. support of Israel makes us complicit in the war crimes that are being committed?
Yes, and that applies to Israel. That also applies to Saudi Arabia. And I call for an even-handed foreign policy across the board, where we are very clear, and with all due humility, because we ourselves have been, leading the charge in war crimes and in human rights abuses, but that as part of turning over a new leaf in our administration, we would inform respectfully our allies that we no longer intend to fund, in the case of Israel, $8 million a day for the Israeli army, which is committing flagrant human rights abuses, war crimes, occupation, home demolitions, assassinations, collective punishment, you name it, just human rights violations across the board. We cannot continue to sanction that, not in the case of Israel, nor in the case of Saudi Arabia, and we need to put our weight firmly on the side of a process that brings together the grassroots groups who are actually making progress themselves between the Israelis and the Palestinians. They have human rights groups themselves that are beginning in a very effective way to establish trust, to build confidence, to build a sense of community. That's what we need to be supporting. So it's not us imposing our solution on them, but we need to stop supporting a flagrant offense against human rights in the form of the current Israeli government.
This question is for you as well, Dr. Stein. You said that the Iranian deal is not viewed as a threat by most intelligence services, and that it should be used as a template to denuclearize the Middle East. My question is, who do you trust, either by name in terms of leaders or countries, who do you trust in the Middle East to help implement this policy?
I think it's a question of negotiations, and I think we need to sit down with not only with the Iranians, with the Israelis, with really Iraq, with all of the countries of the Middle East to create a nuclear-free Middle East. In the case of Iran, there was a question about Iran having a nuclear program in the future, and that was disputed by many intelligence agencies. But this was a future threat at worst, whereas there are countries right now who are violating nuclear agreements. Israel has nuclear weapons, and they're not supposed to. Pakistan, India. There are many countries that have nuclear weapons. We need to sit down with the Russians in particular, because we have the bulk of nuclear weapons. And right now we are investing $1 trillion in a new generation of nuclear weapons at a time when Mikhail Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union, in his words, we are at the most dangerous nuclear weapons moment that we have ever been in history.
Since I got 20 seconds here, a quick follow-up, since you mentioned Russia a couple times tonight. Can you hit the reset button? Can you sit down with Russia after the accusation of what Putin has been alleged to do in this campaign?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, what Putin has been alleged to do is to have hacked. We hack all the time. I mean, and the Russians, in fact, have been trying to get us to sit down and collaborate on a treaty against cyber warfare. So, I think we can have principled negotiations with the Russians about nuclear weapons and about cyber warfare.
Governor Johnson, another compatibility question for you. You have said that Iran is not a military threat, and yet you oppose the Iran deal on the grounds that Iran is, your words, the #1 financier of terror around the world, close quote. How are those two statements compatible?
Well, I was skeptical of the Iran deal because they were and arguably may be a major funder of terrorism in the world. Now, with regard to the number, $165 billion, that is a number, or that is money that needs to be monitored as to whether or not that does end up in the hands of terrorists. And as President of the United States, I'm pledging to honor all treaties and obligations. So given that the Iran deal has been signed, I'm going to line up on the optimistic side that this actually will prevail, that surveillance, that monitoring is in place, and that we will be able to see and monitor that they are not engaged in the development of nuclear weapons. So like I say, I'm going to be optimistic about this deal, and I'm going to support this deal as President of the United States, but coming into it pessimistically, I think that's probably a good, that would be my overall, outlook on military intervention. Is I'm a skeptic.
Well, as President of the United States, Governor Johnson, how would you deal with this? The government is accepting, as we know at this moment, very few Syrian refugees, that is, and yet we continue to preach to the world about human rights. How would you handle that situation as president?
I think we should increase taking in Syrian refugees, believing that there will be and that there is a very intense vetting process taking place. When the debate occurred the other night between Clinton and Trump, and they started talking about safe zones, the first thing that came to my mind was about 6 different questions. I'm not receiving national security briefings, but I'm going to guess that in those national security briefings, they were talking about safe zones. Well, safe zones, what does that mean? Does that mean boots on the ground? That is going to mean U.S. troops on the ground. And is that then not going to become a sanctuary for the Islamists and open then to getting attacked, and that U.S. troops will lose their lives? I think a much more viable strategy would be to increase those refugees allowed into this country, and we could also step up funding, and we are funding refugees in the surrounding countries. So Jordan being one of those, we could increase that funding to allow more refugees, safe havens in adjacent countries.
Same question for you, Dr. Stein. How do you square our not taking in more refugees with this notion of advancing human rights around the world?
Yeah, they can't be squared at all. Right now there are 65 million refugees around the world, which is tearing apart the Middle East and Europe and other places as well. And most of these refugees are being created by the wars that we have instigated largely. So we need to take responsibility for these refugees. We also need to stop these wars that continue to generate more, and that's where I think the weapons embargo and the freeze on the bank accounts of those countries who are continuing to fund terrorism, I think fundamentally you gotta stop what's generating this problem. But in the meantime, we have to accept our proportional responsibility, and we need to take a large portion of the Syrian refugees that we have played so large a part in creating.
If you both give me a 30-second answer to this question, I think I can squeeze it in before this program ends. Our time runs so fast around here. You both propose to drastically cut military spending. How do you do that and keep us safe, Governor Johnson?
Well, the BRAC Commission itself in the mid-90s said that 25% more U.S. bases could have been closed, but the political will has not existed to see that take place. So submitting a balanced budget to Congress, a 20% reduction in military spending will not compromise an invincible national defense.
So our bloated and dangerous military budget is not making us safer. It's making us less safe. So we need to cut back to where we were before 2001, because the military budget that we have right now is it's not helping us. It's consuming half of our discretionary budget. So we need to cut back. For example, this $1 trillion program and a new generation of nuclear weapons. That makes us less safe, not more safe. There are many ways that we can cut, and I just want to say, I hope we can do this again. I think this has been a really important debate, and in addition to the online debate, I hope Governor Johnson will consider doing more of these debates at a time when the American people are really clamoring for something other than these two candidates being rammed down their throats.
I take your cue. That does wrap night 2 of this debate here on television, but the third part of this debate can be seen at pbs.org. /Tavis Smiley, an exclusive conversation for another 30 minutes or so with Governor Johnson and Dr. Stein as we continue talking about these important issues in this all-important election season. You can see that conversation at 11:30 p.m. Pacific time tonight, right after the West Coast version of this show airs. Until then, thanks for watching. Thank you both for being here, and keep the faith as always.